Mercedes just revealed something in Australia that nobody expected, not even Lewis Hamilton. In the very first qualifying session of the 2026 season, Mercedes suddenly became almost 1 second faster than Ferrari. George Russell took pole. Antonelli locked the front row, and the gap was brutal. More than 8 tenths to the closest Ferrari. But here is the detail that has the entire paddock talking tonight. The data Ferrari saw after qualifying does not match what Mercedes showed in practice. Something changed. Something appeared only when the cars went for the final laps. And Lewis Hamilton noticed it immediately, because after more than a decade inside Mercedes, he knows exactly how their cars behave. Which means if Hamilton looks surprised, something unusual is happening. Tonight we are going to break down the hidden clue inside the qualifying data, the performance spike nobody can fully explain yet, and the technical theories spreading through the paddock about a possible Mercedes power advantage that could change the entire 2026 season. And trust me, the most important detail appears at the end of the lap. If you love deep Formula One analysis and the stories happening behind the data, subscribe to the channel now, because this season might become one of the most fascinating technical battles we have seen in years. The Australian Grand Prix weekend did not begin with Mercedes' dominance. In fact, the first hours in Melbourne told a completely different story. Ferrari looked fast, very fast. During the first practice session, both red cars immediately jumped to the top of the timing screens. Charles Leclerc finished first. Lewis Hamilton followed right behind him. A Ferrari won too, the kind of result that instantly changes the mood inside the paddock. Because this was not testing. This was the first real race weekend of the 2026 season. And suddenly, the SF26 looked like a serious contender. But even in that moment of excitement, something interesting was already happening behind the scenes. Lewis Hamilton gave a very careful description of the car. He did not say the Ferrari felt perfect. He did not say the Ferrari was dominant. He said something much more revealing. The car was competitive, but challenging. Now that word matters more than people think. Because when drivers say a car is challenging, it usually means one thing. The speed is there, but the window to extract that speed is very narrow. And that detail became critical once the weekend moved forward. Because Albert Park is a circuit that punishes instability. Fast direction changes, high-speed braking zones, long acceleration zones between corners. If the car is not perfectly balanced, the lap time disappears instantly. Still, Ferrari entered qualifying with serious confidence. The long-run simulations looked strong. The tire management appeared very promising. And both drivers felt comfortable pushing the car harder as the track evolved. Inside the Ferrari garage, there was a quiet belief growing. Maybe pole position was possible. But that belief started to fade the moment qualifying began. Because Mercedes arrived in Q1 with something different. At first, the lap times looked normal. Competitive, but not terrifying. Then Q2 started. And suddenly the Mercedes cars began climbing higher and higher on the timing sheets. Not by small margins, by noticeable chunks of time. Engineers from multiple teams started watching the sector splits very closely, because something unusual was happening. The Mercedes cars were gaining time in places where no one expected such a large advantage. High-speed corners, fast transitions, and especially the exits of medium-speed turns. That is where the gap began to open. By the time Q3 arrived, the pattern was impossible to ignore. George Russell delivered a pole lap that shocked several teams in the pit lane. Not just because he was fast, but because of how fast he was compared to everyone else. More than 8 tenths faster than Charles Leclerc. In modern Formula One qualifying, that kind of margin feels enormous. And yet the story does not end there. Because when Ferrari engineers began comparing the telemetry after the session, another detail appeared. One that might explain why Lewis Hamilton looked so surprised when he stepped out of the car. But that detail only becomes clear when you analyze the exact moment the Mercedes cars start gaining the most time. And strangely enough, it does not begin in the corners. When Ferrari engineers finally opened the telemetry comparisons after qualifying, one detail immediately stood out. The time Mercedes gained was not where most people expected. It was not mainly in the middle of the corner, and it was not only on the straights either. The biggest difference appeared in the transition between those two moments. Corner exit, the exact moment when the driver returns to full throttle. That is where the Mercedes cars suddenly look different, almost too stable. Through Albert Park's medium speed sections, Russell and Antonelli could apply power earlier than everyone else. Just a fraction earlier. But in Formula One, a fraction of a second on throttle becomes massive over an entire lap. because once the car accelerates earlier, it carries that speed through the entire following straight. And this is where engineers started asking deeper questions. Why could the Mercedes drivers trust the rear of the car so much? Why did the car remain so planted when the power came in? Some observers initially believed it was purely aerodynamic, a very efficient floor, a diffuser working perfectly. But when analysts slowed down the onboard footage frame by frame, another possibility started circulating inside the paddock. Energy deployment, specifically the way Mercedes might be using the hybrid system during the lap. Because if the electrical power from the motor generator unit is released in a very precise window, the acceleration becomes smoother, more progressive, more controlled, and that can transform the balance of the car during corner exit. Instead of delivering power like a sudden punch, it becomes a perfectly managed surge. That means less wheel spin, more traction, and more confidence for the driver. Now remember something important. The 2026 power unit regulations changed the way teams manage electrical deployment, which means software and energy strategy suddenly became one of the most powerful performance tools on the grid. And several engineers suspect Mercedes may have discovered something clever in that area. A way to deploy the energy in qualifying that creates a temporary advantage during the most critical parts of the lap. But here is where the situation becomes even more fascinating, because Lewis Hamilton knows those systems extremely well. He spent years working with Mercedes engineers, understanding exactly how their hybrid power unit behaves under different conditions. So when Ferrari compared Russell's telemetry against Hamilton's lap, something looked unfamiliar. Not illegal, not suspicious in a regulatory sense, just unfamiliar. The acceleration profile did not behave exactly like previous Mercedes systems Hamilton had experienced. And that small difference may explain why the Ferrari garage suddenly became very quiet after qualifying ended. Because if Mercedes really found a new way to unlock more performance from a hybrid system during a single lap, then today's qualifying gap might not be an accident. It might be the first real signal of a much bigger advantage. But to understand why this could become even more dangerous for the rest of the grid, we need to look at another detail most viewers completely missed during the session. A detail that appeared in the final sector of Russell's pole lap. And once you see it, the entire picture begins to change. But the most revealing part of the entire qualifying session did not happen in the first sector. It did not happen in the second sector either. It happened in the final part of the lap, Sector 3. Because when engineers compared the last section of Russell's pole lap with the Ferrari data, the pattern suddenly became much clearer. Ferrari was not losing massive time in the corners themselves. In fact, through some of the slower turns, the SF26 looked extremely competitive, sometimes almost identical to the Mercedes pace. But the moment the drivers exited those corners, the gap began to grow again. Not dramatically, not instantly, but consistently. Russell's car simply kept accelerating, cleanly, smoothly, without hesitation. And this is where something very interesting appeared in the telemetry traces. The power delivery curve from the Mercedes looked unusually stable. Normally, when drivers exit a corner and apply full throttle, the power unit delivers energy in waves. Small fluctuations, tiny adjustments. That is completely normal in hybrid Formula One systems. But Russell's data looked different. The power curve appeared almost perfectly linear, as if the energy deployment had been smoothed out to eliminate those small interruptions. And that might sound like a small technical detail, but in Formula One, small technical details can create enormous lap time gains, because a smoother acceleration means the tires maintain grip longer, which means the driver can trust the rear of the car earlier, which means the throttle goes down earlier, and that chain reaction multiplies through every straight that follows. Over one lap in Albert Park, that advantage can easily become several tenths. Now combine that with another observation several analysts noticed during the session. The Mercedes cars were not particularly slower on the straights despite running what appeared to be higher downforce. That is unusual. Normally, if you increase downforce to gain stability in corners, you lose straight line speed. But Mercedes seemed to have both. Stability in high-speed sections and strong acceleration on the straights, which suggests one possibility that several technical observers are now discussing quietly. Mercedes may have achieved something extremely rare, a perfect balance between aerodynamic efficiency and hybrid energy deployment. In other words, the car is not just fast. The systems inside the car are working together in a way that multiplies performance. Aerodynamics helping the tires, tires helping traction, traction helping the hybrid system deploy energy more efficiently. And once that cycle begins, the performance advantage grows very quickly. That would explain why the Mercedes pace suddenly looked so dominant once qualifying reached its final phase. Because when the drivers pushed for the absolute limit, the system delivered its maximum benefit. Meanwhile, Ferrari showed a slightly different behavior. The SF26 appears very strong in overall balance and tire management, which is why many analysts still believe Ferrari could be extremely dangerous in race conditions. But in pure qualifying performance, the Ferrari seems to operate inside a narrower setup window. If everything aligns perfectly, the car becomes very fast. But if the conditions move even slightly outside that window, the lap time begins to slip away.